The first time I noticed he didn't love me anymore, it was in the way he poured his coffee. He used to hand me a mug before I even asked. Cream stirred just right. The handle turned toward me like a small, consistent kindness. But by last fall, he'd make his own and walk away, leaving the pot half full, the silence trailing behind him like a fog. I told myself it was stress, deadlines, the economy, any excuse that would dull the sharpness of the truth. But deep down, I already knew. His heart had started packing its bags long before his suitcase did. Before I continue narrating the story of Steph, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. His name was Jared, and he used to be my safe place. We met in college when everything felt possible, when 2 shared jokes and a midnight pizza could mean forever. He said I was the smartest girl in the room, even when I spilled ramen on his thesis draft. When he proposed, it was raining, and he used a gum wrapper folded into a ring. I laughed so hard I cried, but those tears were joy then, not the kind that arrive in silence, salt, and disbelief. The unraveling didn't happen in explosions, but in inches. He started saying I was overreacting when I brought up the canceled dates, the unanswered texts. My voice began to soften, not from grace, but from shrinking, learning how not to disturb him. He worked late more often, said the team needed him, said the startup was about to break through. What broke instead was the space between us, a fracture he never tried to fix. I kept trying, though, like women do. I booked the couples retreat he never showed up for, learned his favorite meals again, started reading about crypto just to have something to talk about. He looked at me like I was a stranger, and then like I was a burden. The last time I asked him how his day was, he said, "Can't you just let me eat in peace?" And I stared at my plate like it had the answer. It didn't. One day in early December, he didn't come home. No text, no voicemail, just absence. When he did return, smelling like hotel soap and apologies, he handed me a single tulip. It was crushed on one side. That night, I sat alone on the porch in Jared's oversized hoodie, the one I used to borrow when the world felt cold. The air bit through it now, sharp and unforgiving, but I stayed until my fingers went numb. I didn't cry. Not then. I had cried so much over the past year that my body had forgotten how. A week later, I found a receipt in the laundry. A spa weekend booked for 2. The reservation name wasn't mine. I didn't confront him. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I just folded it in half and slipped it between the pages of my planner under the section marked "To Do." I started waking up earlier than usual, just to breathe in the house before he filled it with tension. I lit candles in the morning, lavender, sandalwood, peace in a jar. I made lists, lots of them, passwords, account numbers, contacts he didn't know I had. The lists made me feel like I had a spine again. Every bullet point a bone forming under my skin. On the 15th, I overheard him laughing in the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear. "I bet she cries," he said, voice full of smug certainty, "especially when she sees the date." My hand stopped drying the dishes. I waited. He thought he was clever, serving heartbreak in wrapping paper. I'd always known Jared admired spectacle more than sincerity. He'd proposed in a crowded bar, loud enough for strangers to cheer. He thought divorce should be no different. The audience would be his parents, my brother, and the ugly centerpiece I'd bought for Christmas dinner. That was when I decided, if he wanted a show, I'd give him a finale he'd never forget. Not with screaming, not with a meltdown, but with silence wrapped in gold foil and timing sharper than a knife. It would be the quietest thunder anyone ever heard. I called Laura the next morning. She'd been my best friend since high school, and now she was a family law attorney with eyes like glass and a memory like a vault. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice flat but steady. "I'm done being sorry for existing," I said. "Let's draft something airtight." Over peppermint tea and candlelight, we reviewed everything. The savings account he didn't know I had, the voice recordings I'd captured when he thought I was asleep, screenshots, signed credit card statements. I even had photos of the tulip, proof, not of abuse, but of disdain dressed as love. Laura worked fast. She always did. By the 20th, the paperwork was done. Filed. Bound. All I had to do was deliver it. Meanwhile, Jared wrapped my gift in gold paper with green velvet ribbon, thinking he was Shakespeare. He joked with his friend Matt over text. "She'll probably faint. Bet you 50 she does the full waterworks." I smiled when I saw it. Let him bet. I made Christmas dinner like always, honey-glazed carrots, rosemary chicken, mashed potatoes with browned butter. My brother brought wine. Jared's parents brought stories I'd heard 1,000 times. I brought calm. The tree sparkled in the corner, and the lights blinked in time with my heartbeat. When Jared stood up and tapped his glass, my spine didn't buckle. "I have a little surprise," he said, grinning like a game show host. He handed me the envelope like a prize. "Merry Christmas." I opened it slowly, carefully, like it was a letter from a past life. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Bolded, dated, filed. My hands didn't shake. I looked up at him and smiled. Not kindly, but clearly. "Thank you," I said. "Would you like yours now?" I reached under the table and pulled out a box, matte black with gold trim, placed it gently in front of him. "Go ahead." "Open it." He hesitated. I nodded. "It's okay. I made sure it matches the season." Jared tugged the ribbon loose with the same smirk he'd worn at our wedding, when he said vows he never meant. The lid came off too easily, like everything else in his life, and inside sat a leather folder, simple, slim, devastating. He opened it and scanned the first page, his eyes flicking fast, then slowing down as realization dragged across his expression like claws. His jaw tightened as he flipped another page, and his smirk faltered in real time. Across the table, my brother froze mid-sip of wine, his eyes darting between us like he'd stumbled into a scene he didn't audition for. Jared swallowed hard and tried to laugh, but it came out brittle and strange. "What is this?" he asked, though he already knew. Every clause was in his handwriting, dated, initialed, notarized in ink that still smelled fresh. "It's the agreement you signed 6 months ago," I said calmly, folding my hands on the table like a teacher waiting for a student to catch up. "You gave me everything, Jared." "I just wrapped it nicely." His mother leaned forward slightly, trying to read from her seat, squinting as if the document might explain away her son's expression. My brother leaned back, arms crossed, watching without speaking. Jared looked to me like he wanted to laugh again, or maybe yell, but couldn't figure out which one would give him back the upper hand. "You filed?" he asked, voice thinner now. "I filed 10 minutes before you did," I replied. "And unlike yours, mine holds up." Laura had timed it perfectly, submitting our paperwork with digital timestamps he couldn't undo. The signed asset transfer agreement Jared drunkenly scrawled over a whiskey sour had become the hinge of my entire plan. I had filed a legal motion before dinner, just enough time for the court to log mine as the initiating party. In his arrogance, Jared had walked me straight into freedom, believing I'd panic at his performance. But I didn't flinch. He looked at the document like it had bitten him, flipping to the last page where Laura's firm had signed off. "This is trickery," he mumbled, like a child who lost a board game. "No," I said, tilting my head. "It's preparation. You taught me well." Jared's face flushed red, the kind of slow, seeping color that spreads when someone realizes they've lost the audience. His best friend Matt, who had once texted Jared about my predictable meltdown, looked like he wanted to disappear into the mashed potatoes. My brother finally took another sip of wine, letting it settle with a quiet, "Huh." The room wasn't cold, but Jared's parents suddenly looked chilled. And me? I felt like sunlight. "I thought you'd beg," Jared said, and his voice cracked just a little, splintered at the edges. "You thought I'd cry," I replied, holding his gaze like a mirror. "That was your biggest mistake. You assumed breaking me would be theatrical." I leaned closer across the table. "But I've been broken already, Jared. You just didn't see it because I still made you dinner." He stood suddenly, chair scraping against the hardwood like a warning shot. "You're doing this in front of my parents," he snapped, tone laced with disbelief. I raised an eyebrow. "No, Jared. You did this the moment you chose to humiliate me on Christmas." My voice didn't rise. It sharpened. The silence that followed was thick, a vacuum sealed around the truth. Jared looked down at the folder again, hands trembling ever so slightly. He saw the addendum Lara had added about spousal support, custody rights, and asset division, all legally binding, all undeniably his idea. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he muttered, quieter now. "You never mean for anything to happen," I said. "And yet, here we are." My brother stood slowly, pushing back his chair with a calmed deliberateness that made Jared flinch. "Steph," he said, nodding toward me, "you want help with dessert?" It was the softest show of allegiance, but it hit like applause. I smiled. "In a minute." Jared's mother spoke for the first time since dinner began. "You're pregnant?" she asked, eyes wide, voice frail. I nodded, placing a hand gently on my stomach. 8 weeks. "Doctor confirmed last Thursday." Her lips parted like she wanted to ask more, but no words followed. Jared blinked, the second realization hitting him harder than the first. He reached for the sonogram tucked into the folder, stared at it like it might rewrite everything he just read. "You can't use the baby against me," he said, as if this was a trial and not his own stage spectacle turned inside out. "She's not a weapon, Jared. She's a beginning." He lowered himself into the chair again, slower this time. Like gravity had increased. His fingers traced the edge of the folder, his eyes distant. The man who once joked that I couldn't set up a smart TV without him now sat lost in paperwork he signed himself. His confidence cracked like glass in heat, 1,000 tiny fractures revealing the hollow underneath. "I underestimated you," he finally whispered. I nodded. "You always did." My brother returned with a tray of pie, awkwardly placing it between the centerpieces like it might fix something. Matt stared into his wine, clearly regretting every smug text he'd ever sent. And I reached for the whipped cream. Jared stared at me like he was trying to find the version of me he remembered. The one who apologized first, who softened every edge to keep the peace. That woman had died quietly, over late dinners in muted silence. In her place stood someone rebuilt, not spiteful, not vindictive, just done. "I'll fight this," he said suddenly, as if defiance could turn back time. "You're welcome to try," I said, not angry, just honest. "But I have everything, every withdrawal, every receipt. Every night you said you were working late while she posted pictures from your room." Matt's head shot up, eyes wide. "You told her about me," he whispered. Jared didn't answer. Of course he hadn't. He'd just been sloppy. "You made your choices," I said, folding my napkin. "Now you can live with them." I stood, smoothing my dress, and turned to my brother. "Okay, now I'll take that pie." My brother handed me a plate like it was a peace offering, though no war had started on my end. I took it with a nod, the pecan pie still warm, steam curling into the silence like a breath no one wanted to take. Jared watched me as if I'd morphed into someone new, someone he couldn't read. The truth was, I hadn't changed overnight. He just never bothered to learn who I actually was. I sat beside my brother and took a bite, savoring the caramel and crunch. Jared's mother reached for her wine glass, lips tight, knuckles white around the stem. "Should we go?" she whispered to Jared's father, who blinked like he'd been roused from a daze. "No," I said softly. "Stay if you like." I didn't plan to ruin Christmas. He did. Matt muttered something under his breath, then stood up abruptly. "I've got somewhere to be," he said, avoiding everyone's eyes. He dropped his napkin and didn't bother picking it up. Jared didn't stop him. No one did. After Matt left, the tension didn't ease. It thickened, like smoke that couldn't find a vent. Jared flipped through the prenup pages again, slower this time, like the words might arrange themselves differently if he read them with enough disbelief. "You kept this from me for months?" he asked, incredulous. "You mean the thing you signed and then forgot about?" I replied, stabbing another bite of pie. "Yes, Jared. I preserved the evidence of your carelessness." He looked to his parents as if they might object on his behalf, but they sat quietly, eyes cast downward, pretending to be guests at someone else's disaster. My brother took another bite and said, "You know, for someone who used to call Steph dramatic, you sure pulled the most dramatic move of all." Jared's jaw clenched. "It was meant to be clean," he muttered. Divorce papers on Christmas? My brother asked, eyebrow raised. You think that's clean? I could have defended Jared once, made excuses for his decisions like I used to, but those days were long gone. He thought it would be poetic. I said instead, like every bad sitcom rolled into one. I turned to Jared then, looking him square in the eye. You thought I'd make this easy, but I didn't spend months surviving you just to surrender now. Jared stared at the sonogram again, his expression shifting. You should have told me about the baby. Why? I asked. So you could weaponize that, too? He shook his head, but the guilt bled through the cracks in his face. That's not fair. Fair? I echoed, setting my plate down carefully. You orchestrated my public humiliation over dessert, he didn't respond. I wasn't going to use the baby against you, I continued. But I wasn't going to let her grow up thinking men like you are heroes either. Jared's mother looked away, guilt tracing the lines in her face. His father cleared his throat like he wanted to interrupt, but thought better of it. The silence returned, not awkward, but absolute, like the space left behind after something essential burns away. I should go, Jared said quietly, more to the room than to me. Yes, I replied. You should. He stood and paused, as if expecting someone to stop him. No one did. My brother didn't move. His parents stayed seated. I didn't blink. He left his gift on the table, untouched, wrapped too tightly like he tried to overcompensate for the hollowness inside it. The door closed behind him with a soft click. It should have echoed, but it didn't. All I felt was air, finally moving, finally mine. My brother reached over and refilled my wine. That was something, he said after a beat. I smiled, not for show, but for real. Merry Christmas, I said, raising my glass. He clinked his gently against mine and replied, and to all, a good night. We cleaned up together, scraping plates and stacking leftovers into mismatched containers. Jared's parents offered to help, but I could see in their eyes they weren't sure what they were supposed to do anymore. Their loyalty had always been fragile, stretched between appearances and reality. But tonight, it finally snapped. I let them stay as long as they wanted, not because I owed them kindness, but because I had nothing left to prove. Eventually, they left too. When the house emptied, the quiet didn't scare me. It wrapped around me like a blanket, soft and strange, but not cold. I turned off the tree lights and washed the last wine glass, my hand steady even under warm water. In the reflection of the kitchen window, I saw myself, hair pulled back, eyes tired but clear. I didn't look like a woman who had been left. I looked like a woman who had chosen. I walked upstairs alone, stepping over the creaky stair he used to complain about. I didn't avoid it. I stepped right on it, let it creak, let it echo through the empty hallway like a new anthem. In our bedroom, I pulled off my dress, folded it neatly, and slid into flannel pajamas that still smelled like lavender. I brushed my teeth, washed my face, and didn't flinch at my reflection. I was tired, but it was the kind of tired that comes after a marathon, not a breakdown. My belly rounded slightly under the fabric of my shirt, and I rested a hand there without thinking. I've got you, I whispered to the life growing inside me. You'll never have to wonder what love looks like. She kicked, just once, soft and steady, and I smiled because I knew this wasn't the end. It was the very beginning. The next morning I woke up before sunrise, the light barely filtering through the edges of the blinds. The house was so quiet it almost hummed, a kind of stillness I hadn't heard in years. I sat up slowly, letting the chill of the wooden floor ground me before reaching for the robe draped over the chair. Downstairs, the scent of last night's cinnamon candles lingered faintly, sweeter than it had smelled when he lived here. I turned on the kettle and let the sound of water boiling fill the emptiness with something softer than memory. As I waited, I pulled out my planner, the one that held grocery lists and silent evidence. The page for December 26th was already marked with a small star and 2 checkboxes, locksmith and attorney follow-up. I had no interest in revenge anymore, not after what I'd already reclaimed. This was about maintenance now, not demolition, about clearing the wreckage without stepping on the same shards twice. The phone rang just as I was pouring tea, and I knew before I picked up that it would be Laura. Morning, she said, her voice clipped but kind. I got the court's confirmation just after midnight. Your filing is officially the one on record. I exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. He'll probably try to contest it. I said. He can try, she replied. But we've got time, proof, and precedent on our side. We spent the next few minutes reviewing next steps. Temporary financial controls, safe contact protocols, and securing the house. She asked if I needed her to drop off anything in person, and I said no, not yet. The truth was, I needed a day without paperwork. Just one day to feel like a woman again, not a case file. Take a breath, Steph, Lara said before hanging up. You've already won more than he ever thought you could. After I hung up, I stared at my phone for a moment, then deleted his number from my contacts. Not to erase him. He was part of my story, unfortunately, but to reclaim space on my screen. Every tiny deletion felt like breathing room, like sweeping out a corner of myself he used to occupy. I didn't cry. Not once. By 10 a.m., the locksmith arrived. An older man with silver eyebrows and the kind of calm that comes from decades of watching people start over. He didn't ask questions when I said none of the old keys should work. He nodded, got to work, and left me with a fresh set of locks and a new sense of ownership. I held the keys in my palm like they were something sacred. For the first time in a long time, I had something no one could take from me without asking. In the afternoon, I moved his clothes out of the bedroom, not with anger, not with tears, just methodically, one hanger at a time. His cologne still clung to a few shirts, and I opened a window to let the air shift. I boxed everything carefully, labeled it storage, and slid it into the hall closet. I didn't throw anything out, I just removed it from my orbit. The sonogram sat on my nightstand, the corners curling slightly from how many times I'd picked it up. I rested a hand on my belly and thought about names. Strong ones, soft ones, names that meant light or hope or beginning. I hadn't told anyone else yet, not even my brother or Beth. But I would. When it felt more like celebration and less like counterbalance. By dinner time, I'd filled a box with old frames and photos we no longer belonged to. The wedding picture with the fake smile. The vacation shot where he cropped out my arm. All of them went into the same box, taped shut, and marked, donate. I didn't need reminders of what pretending looked like. I was done giving memories space they didn't deserve. That night, I lit a fire in the fireplace and curled up on the couch with a blanket and a book I'd been meaning to read for months. No wine, no distractions. Just me, my breath, and the slow understanding that peace doesn't always arrive loudly. It sometimes just sits beside you and waits for you to notice. And I finally did. Around 9 p.m., my brother texted, "You okay?" I replied with a photo of the fireplace and a single word, better. He sent back a heart emoji and a gif of a cat knocking over a glass of water. I laughed. For the first time in what felt like years, it wasn't bitter or forced. The next morning, Beth called, her voice bright and full of too much energy for someone who had witnessed a slow-motion, emotional implosion 2 nights ago. "So you're officially a legend," she said. "Everyone's still talking about the prenup drop like it was a movie premiere." I groaned into my pillow. "Please tell me you're not repeating it like a bedtime story to your kids." "Nope," she said. "But I may have recited the final scene to our neighbor while holding a glass of wine." I let her talk, let her fill the line with warmth and distraction, and only interrupted to tell her one thing. "I'm pregnant," I said softly. The pause that followed was brief, but thick with emotion. "Steph," she whispered, and then said nothing else for a few moments, just silence, soft and shared. "We'll throw the most ridiculous baby shower the world's ever seen." I smiled so hard my cheeks hurt. "You'd better." And just like that, the baby wasn't a secret anymore. It was a beginning, something solid, one could look forward to without flinching. Jared might try to twist it later, use it in some courtroom plea. But he wouldn't win. I had already written the ending to the chapter he tried to steal. And now I was writing the next one myself. The baby shower planning started 2 days later, and Beth was already texting me pictures of decorations shaped like giraffes and moons. "I vote soft yellow and sage green," she said, clearly thrilled to channel all her energy into something light. I didn't object. I needed the distraction, something to remind me that joy still belonged in my life. We hadn't set a date yet, but it didn't matter. Just thinking about tiny socks and pastel frosting gave the days a different rhythm. Even the silence between messages felt more hopeful now, less like loneliness and more like space being cleared for something new. I spent the next few afternoons painting the guest room, slowly transforming it into a nursery. Every brushstroke felt like a quiet declaration. This space will be safe. The crib arrived early, and I assembled it alone on a rainy Thursday. The sound of the Allen wrench scraping against wood strangely satisfying. I took breaks to rest, to sip tea, to press my palm to my belly and feel the small shifts happening inside. The room was filling up with future. Laura checked in with updates, her voice always calm, always grounded in facts and steps and what comes next. His lawyer's trying to argue for joint filing status to preserve financial optics, she said one morning. I almost laughed. He wants appearances more than assets, I replied. Let him keep the illusion. I'll keep everything else. She assured me we were still in control, that my documentation was airtight, and that my actions had been measured. You've been 10 steps ahead, she said. He's just now realizing he wasn't playing chess. He was the board. I wrote that quote down later in my journal, under a header that read, "For the days I forget." Beneath it, I wrote, "You survived his shadow. Now stand in your own light." The mail started changing. His name disappeared from bank statements. Credit card offers now came addressed to just me. I didn't update the nameplate on the mailbox yet, but it was coming. Little things were adding up. A different laundry rhythm, one coffee mug in the sink, only my shoes at the door. I didn't cry over the absences. I didn't celebrate them either. I just noticed. One morning, I caught myself humming while making oatmeal. It startled me, not because it was loud, but because it was natural. I hadn't hummed in years. The house didn't just feel quieter now, it felt like mine. Beth came over that weekend, her toddler clinging to her leg and a tray of muffins in hand. I figured you needed these more than I did, she said, kicking off her shoes like she owned the place. Her son ran straight to the nursery and started poking at the wall decals I'd just finished sticking up. You're doing good, Beth said after a pause, watching me from across the kitchen. Better than good, actually. You look lighter. I nodded and leaned against the counter. I feel like I'm rebuilding muscle after an injury. Everything's tender, but growing back stronger. She smiled. Your metaphor game is getting better too, I laughed into my tea. Turns out survival teaches you more than self-help books ever could. The conversation drifted to baby names, and we went back and forth for a while, vetoing anything that sounded like a pop star or ex-boyfriend. No Emmas, no Aidens, and absolutely no J names, Beth declared, and I didn't need her to explain that last one. I liked the idea of a name that meant resilience or warmth or clarity. Something soft, but not fragile. Something that would grow well on a woman who knew her worth from day one. Later that night, after Beth left and the house settled again, I opened the email from Laura I'd been avoiding. Attached was a scanned copy of Jared's formal counter. He'd finally responded. It was 3 pages of posturing, passive language, and veiled threats dressed up as compromise. I read it twice, then closed the tab without replying. I didn't need to react. That was the difference now. I wasn't building my life in response to his anymore. I was simply building. The next day, I bought a new comforter for the master bedroom, white with gold stitching, like tiny constellations sewn into the fabric. I stripped the bed completely, tossed the old sheets into a donation bag, and vacuumed under every inch of the frame. Then I made the bed with crisp corners and fluffed pillows that hadn't held his head in weeks. That night, I slept like I'd been exhaled from my own story. A week passed before Jared tried to text me. It came in the middle of a Tuesday. I miss you. Can we talk? I stared at the screen for a long time, thumb hovering over the delete button. Then I took a screenshot, forwarded it to Laura, and blocked his number. The past was no longer an invitation. 2 days later, a letter arrived in the mail. No return address, just my name scrawled in rushed handwriting I recognized too well. I opened it with steady fingers. Inside was a single sentence. I didn't know how bad I was until you stopped reacting. No apology, no ownership, just a confession dressed as reflection. I folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and didn't respond. Maybe one day I'd burn it. Maybe I'd forget it existed. But I would never let it rewrite what I already knew. I had survived his absence long before I ever survived his presence. Now I was learning to thrive in both. Before I narrate what happens next, Kindly let me know if you have any questions so far and why you haven't subscribed yet. By the time January faded into February, I had developed a rhythm that didn't revolve around damage control. Mornings began with lemon water and prenatal vitamins, followed by slow walks through the neighborhood wrapped in an oversized cardigan. People waved. People I hadn't noticed when I was too busy shrinking inside my own home. I began to remember their names. The retired teacher with a dachshund named Milo, the couple who ran the bakery near the corner, the twins who delivered newspapers on matching scooters. It felt like being reintroduced to a world I'd been quietly exiting for years. The nursery had taken on its own scent, powdery soft with notes of cedar and dried lavender tucked into tiny linen sachets. I placed a rocking chair near the window and sometimes just sat there, listening to rain tap against the glass like gentle applause. I wrote letters to the baby in a journal bound in navy blue cloth, each entry dated and sealed in a tone of quiet hope. I told her about the way sunlight hit the kitchen table at 3 p.m., about the books stacked beside my bed, about the soft strength in starting again. I didn't write about Jared, not because I was erasing him, but because I refused to give him the closing sentence of every chapter. One Thursday morning, while flipping through prenatal appointment paperwork, I noticed an unfamiliar name listed under emergency contacts. It was Jared's. I hadn't added him, which meant it was probably a relic of the old records, a box checked long ago before everything cracked. I called the clinic immediately and asked them to update it with Beth's number. "You're sure?" the receptionist asked gently, not with judgment, just curiosity. "Yes," I said, "I'm sure." She shows up. That night, Beth came over with her hair in a messy braid and a giant tote bag full of coconut milk, candles, and 3 types of sorbet. "You're nesting," she said, smirking as she looked around the freshly vacuumed living room. "I'm preparing," I corrected, but my smile gave me away. We curled up under blankets and watched a cooking competition we didn't care about, laughing at the disasters like we weren't also making something complicated and beautiful from scratch. When her toddler fell asleep against her arm, Beth looked at me with a softness I hadn't seen since we were kids. "You're going to be a good mom," she whispered. I didn't reply. I just nodded and blinked too fast, blaming hormones even though it was relief. Relief that someone believed it, that someone saw me outside the wreckage. I had started to believe it too, but having it reflected back made it real. I was building something new, and for the first time in years, I wasn't doing it just to survive. I was doing it to thrive. The next morning, I had an appointment with Laura. She had offered to meet over video call, but I wanted the weight of the moment to feel tangible. Her office was lined with bookshelves and anchored by a large oak desk that smelled faintly of lemon oil. "He's finally accepted the terms," she said, sliding the papers toward me with a pen already uncapped. "No contest, no amendments, just a signature and surrender." I stared at the final page longer than I needed to, reading every line, even though I already knew them by heart. This wasn't just ink, it was closure. I signed with a hand that didn't shake and looked up as Laura smiled. "You're free," she said. "He can't reach back through this now." Walking out of her office, the sunlight hit differently, crisper, more honest somehow. I stopped at a cafe on the corner and ordered myself a slice of lemon cake, just because it sounded good. As I sat at the window with a fork in one hand and a receipt in the other, I watched people pass by, all going somewhere, none of them carrying my story. And I loved that. I loved the anonymity, the ordinariness, the freedom of being just another woman at a table eating cake at noon. When I got home, I changed into soft cotton pajamas and put on a record I hadn't touched in years. Nina Simone's voice filled the space between the walls, each note settling like dust in places I hadn't cleaned emotionally. I danced in the kitchen, belly forward, feet bare, hair wild. I danced, not for someone watching, but for the girl I used to be, the one who once stood in this same kitchen and wondered if she was asking for too much. Turns out, she wasn't. Jared didn't reach out again after that. No texts, no letters, no dramatics. I wasn't sure if it was dignity or defeat, but I didn't waste energy trying to decode it. Silence from him was finally a gift, not a punishment. Beth told our dad about the baby, and he called me a few days later, his voice unsure but tender. "You okay, kiddo?" he asked. like he didn't want to step on any emotional landmines. "Yeah," I said, and it was true. "I'm okay." There was a pause then. "You always were. You just forgot for a while." I started keeping a list in my journal of small things I could now do without worrying about Jared's mood. Leave dishes in the sink overnight. Watch romantic comedies without eye rolls. Cry during sad commercials without being called dramatic. Play music louder than a whisper. Sleep in the middle of the bed. These tiny freedoms stacked like bricks, slowly forming a new foundation. One afternoon, I moved my old journals out of storage and placed them on a new bookshelf in the baby's room. They weren't for her to read, not yet, maybe not ever, but they reminded me how far I'd come. My story wasn't neat, but it was mine, and I was finally the one writing it. By March, the snow was finally melting off the porch railings, and the birds returned to the trees outside the nursery window. I stood there most mornings now, rubbing my belly in circles and whispering half-formed thoughts to the baby like we were already in conversation. She didn't kick every time, but when she did, it felt like punctuation, like she was agreeing with me in tiny, insistent movements. I hung a mobile above the crib made of soft clouds and stitched stars, the kind of thing I never would have picked when I was still trying to please someone else. Everything in that room was chosen with care, not compromise. Beth came by one Saturday with a paint-splattered hoodie and a box of baby books she'd been collecting from secondhand stores. "You're going to have the most literary infant in the neighborhood," she said, handing me a copy of Goodnight Moon with worn edges. We arranged the books by color, then by size, then gave up and just made stacks wherever they fit. Her toddler was asleep in the stroller, so we tiptoed through the house like we were preserving some sacred stillness. "You seem happy," she whispered as we stood by the nursery door. I thought about it for a second before answering. "I don't know if it's happiness exactly, but it's peace," she nodded slowly. "Sometimes they're the same thing." I looked around the room at the soft rug and freshly washed onesies folded in drawers, and I believed her. There was nothing performative about this space. It was built from scratch, out of memory and intention. Later that week, I received a letter addressed to the former Mrs. Hollis. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and for a moment, I considered throwing it away unopened. Curiosity won. Inside was a note from Jared's aunt, someone I hadn't seen since our third Thanksgiving as a couple. Her message was simple. "I'm sorry he put you through that. He never deserved the way you cared for him." I didn't reply, but I kept the letter. Not as validation, but as a reminder that some people were watching even when I felt invisible. That was something I'd forgotten. How often strength isn't loud, but still gets noticed. I slid it into my journal and wrote beneath it, "Not everyone who sees you is meant to stay, but some leave kind fingerprints behind." It was the first time I thought about forgiveness without tasting bitterness. Jared's lawyer reached out one last time in early April with a list of proposed property dividers for the house, clearly not understanding that I had already been awarded sole ownership. Laura handled it with her usual grace, replying in legal terms that translated to "too late." She already won. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I just added a check mark to the mental list of doors I would never need to reopen. One night, while reorganizing the kitchen, I found an old voicemail saved in my phone from over a year ago. It was Jared, rambling and drunk, leaving a message I'd once replayed for signs of affection buried in the slurred edge of his voice. I listened to it now and heard something entirely different. A man unsure of what he had, unsure of how to hold it, and too arrogant to learn. I deleted it before it finished playing, not out of spite, but because it no longer had any power. The baby moved more now, especially in the evenings. I started playing soft music for her, classical pieces and acoustic covers, even the old records Jared used to complain about. Some part of me hoped she would associate music with safety, with steadiness, not tension or measured silences. Beth joked once that she'd probably be born with a playlist in her head. I hoped so too, one filled with crescendos and kindness. Elena, my cousin from out of state, called to say she'd be driving down for the baby shower. "I want to be there when we fill that house with women who love you," she said, her voice warm with promise. I hadn't seen her in years, not since her wedding, where Jared had made fun of the catering and drank too much before the first dance. "I've got a gift you'll actually want," she added, "and it doesn't need to be returned or apologized for." That made me laugh out loud. When the day of the shower came, the house was filled with the sound of laughter and the rustling of tissue paper. Friends from different corners of my life, old classmates, book club friends I distanced from, even a few neighbors, filled the living room with stories and sparkle. Beth had decorated everything in soft yellow and pale green, just like she promised. The cake was lavender and vanilla, shaped like a moon with the words, "Welcome, little light," piped in gold frosting. I stood in the middle of it all, my hand on my belly, and felt entirely seen. No one mentioned Jared. No one asked where he was or how things ended. It wasn't because they didn't care. It was because they understood. This wasn't a space for his shadow. This was a celebration built entirely in my light. When everyone left, Beth stayed behind and helped me gather stray bows and discarded name tags. We sat on the couch, her feet up on the coffee table, my ankles wrapped in a warm compress. "You did that," she said, looking around the house now quiet again. "You built something sacred out of what tried to bury you." I reached over, squeezed her hand, and whispered, "Thank you for not letting me do it alone." After she left, I stood in the nursery again, one hand tracing the edge of the crib. I felt the baby turn, a slow somersault of reassurance. I turned off the light, leaving only the glow of the star nightlight in the corner. As I walked back to my bedroom, I felt it. Not freedom as a destination, but as a state of being. And for the first time, I didn't wonder what came next. The days after the baby shower felt like something sacred had been sewn into the walls of the house. Even in silence, I could still hear laughter echoing faintly down the hallway, like the memory of music after the last note fades. I left most of the decorations up, not because I was too tired to take them down, but because they made the space feel warm and claimed. Beth texted the next day saying, "I swear, that was better than my wedding." I sent her a picture of the leftover cupcakes arranged like tiny planets and replied, "It was the first party I've thrown just for me." The final paperwork from Lara arrived the following Tuesday, neatly stapled and corner-clipped in a slim manila folder. Everything had been processed. Assets, custody agreements, full legal independence. I sat on the couch with a pen and initialed each page, signing my name without hesitation. The woman who once hesitated before speaking at her own dinner table now held legal control over her own story. When I was done, I didn't cry. I simply exhaled. I mailed it the same afternoon, walking it to the post office myself, ignoring the self-serve kiosk and handing it directly to the clerk with steady hands. "Certified," I said, and she nodded, affixing a label that made everything feel official in a way digital scans never could. As I left, I passed a father walking with his daughter, both of them laughing over something too small to explain. For a moment, my heart clenched, not with sadness, but with longing. Not for Jared, but for the kind of co-parenting I once hoped we'd manage before reality intervened. That night, I opened a fresh journal and titled the first page, "What Comes After." I wrote a single line, "I am allowed to want more now." Then I closed it and ran a warm bath, surrounding myself with lavender oil and flickering candles like I was my own guest of honor. As the water cooled, I imagined what labor would feel like, what her cry would sound like, what her fingers would grasp first. I imagined myself calm, competent, steady, the way I had become, inch by inch. In the middle of April, I ran into Nate at the grocery store, which felt ironic considering he'd once laughed about betting on my breakdown. He was in line for coffee, holding a protein bar, and looking every bit as uncomfortable as someone caught in a room they set on fire. I didn't flinch. I didn't walk the other way either. I just stood behind him, pulled out my shopping list, and waited like he was any other stranger. When he turned around and saw me, his face did that awkward thing men's faces do when they realize the consequences have names and eyes. "Steph," he said, like it was a question, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to say it. "Nate," I replied, evenly. He opened his mouth like he might apologize, then thought better of it. Smart move. He paid quickly and left without another word, and I continued shopping with the serenity of someone whose story had already moved on. That encounter wasn't a confrontation. It was confirmation. Proof that power looks like walking through the same place you were once mocked and not shrinking. I didn't tell Beth about it right away because it didn't matter enough to retell. That was growth. My baby kicked hard that night, enough to make me catch my breath and sit upright in bed. I pressed both hands to my stomach and whispered, "I know. I felt it too." There was so much inside me now. New life, new calm, new definitions of strength that didn't require suffering to be valid. The past had stopped clawing at me, and the future no longer frightened me. I didn't need a map. I was already home. Beth and I went crib mattress shopping the following weekend, which somehow turned into a 3-hour lunch and an impromptu stop at the garden center. "You should plant something," she said as we walked past a row of daffodils. "A tree or a bush, something that grows as she does." I bought a hydrangea without hesitation. We planted it in the backyard that evening. The sky streaked with orange and rose as the sun dipped behind the fence. I dug the hole while Beth read the instructions, and then we took turns patting the soil down like it was a secret we were burying together. "Here's to something beautiful taking root," she said, wiping dirt from her palms. I nodded and whispered, "and never being uprooted again." It wasn't just a plant, it was a promise. Later that night, I checked the court docket online one last time. Jared had signed everything without contest. No notes, no revisions. Just his name and a digital timestamp that felt like the softest full stop I'd ever seen. The baby's room was finished by the end of the month. I hung soft curtains, framed quotes I'd written just for her, and taped a tiny note to the inside of the closet that read, "You are safe here. Always." I didn't tell anyone about the note. It was just for her and me. A small ritual to anchor the space. A declaration that whatever she came into this world needing, I would provide. The week after that, Elena arrived with a suitcase full of old family recipes and a blender she swore would change my life. She moved into the guest room like she'd always lived here, folding herself into the rhythm of my days with ease and laughter. She cooked, cleaned, sang off-key, and filled the quiet spaces with the kind of warmth only family can give. "I'm not here to fix anything," she said one night while making ginger tea. "I'm just here to remind you it already got fixed." We didn't talk about Jared, not because it was off limits, but because it didn't feel necessary. His part in my life had ended with a signature, not a bang, and I refused to give him any more space than the margins he'd already filled. The real story had started long after he left the room. Lena took over the kitchen like it was her calling, whipping up stews and lemon bars and herbal teas I didn't know I needed until they appeared in front of me. She was chaos and comfort wrapped into one, humming 90s R&B while wearing a mismatched apron and quoting our grandmother at random. "You can't rebuild a life on an empty stomach," she'd say while handing me a plate. I didn't argue, mostly because I was too busy eating. Her presence filled every corner of the house with movement, and somehow nothing felt overwhelming. One night after dinner, she handed me a folded piece of paper. "Write something for yourself," she said, "but don't show anyone, not even me." I raised an eyebrow but took it anyway, retreating to the nursery with the familiar ache of vulnerability humming under my ribs. I sat in the rocking chair, placed the note on my lap, and stared at the blank page. Eventually, I wrote 4 words. I did not break. I folded the page and slipped it into the drawer beside the crib, nestled between burp cloths and a backup pacifier. It wasn't a speech, not a manifesto, but it was mine. There was something healing about saying it aloud, even if only in ink. I did not break. I bent, I endured, I adapted, but I did not break. The baby's due date inched closer, and my body began its slow countdown in Braxton Hicks and swollen ankles. Beth visited almost daily, bringing fresh fruit, unsolicited advice, and board books that rhymed. She cleaned out the pantry without asking, and labeled everything in cursive stickers like we were staging for a magazine shoot. "Your life deserves beauty now," she said, brushing her hand over the jar labeled lentils, "even in the tiny things." I smiled and let her arrange my Tupperware drawer without protest. Elena painted her toenails in the living room one afternoon while watching baby name videos on her tablet. "You still undecided?" she asked without looking up. I nodded, stretching my legs out across the ottoman. "I want something that means steady, or brave, or reborn," I said. "But not too obvious." "What about Leora?" she suggested. It means light. I didn't answer right away, letting the word hang in the room like a new melody. Leora. It sounded like a beginning. I whispered it to my belly that night, and she responded with a soft, slow kick. I took it as agreement. The next week passed in slow, tender hours. Doctor appointments, folded onesies, friends dropping by with casseroles, and the soft kind of encouragement that doesn't expect you to perform gratitude. On a quiet Wednesday, I stood barefoot in the backyard, watching the hydrangea we planted months ago sway in the breeze. It had begun to bloom early, bright, lush clusters, unfurling like small declarations. I ran my fingers along the petals and whispered, "You're doing well." I was talking to the flower, but I meant myself. That evening, Beth and Elena hosted a, quote, pre-birth toast in the living room with sparkling juice and confetti I'd still be vacuuming up in August. They toasted to late-night feedings, to a strong heartbeat, to finding peace in imperfect beginnings. To Steph, Beth said, raising her glass, for turning endings into foundations. I teared up, but didn't hide it. There was no shame in feeling full. Around 2 a.m. that night, I felt the first real contraction. It wasn't cinematic, just a deep wave that made me sit up and breathe differently. I didn't panic. I just placed a hand on my belly and said, "Okay, baby, let's do this." Then I texted Beth and Elena, both of whom were ready before I'd even changed out of my robe. The hospital room was calm, the lighting low, the nurses kind without being overbearing. I had packed a playlist, and Nina Simone sang softly through the speakers as the hours rolled by. Elena cracked jokes to distract me while Beth squeezed my hand with quiet strength. It wasn't easy. It wasn't painless, but it was sacred. And in the end, when she arrived, everything stilled. Leora Hollis was born just after sunrise, wrapped in warmth and the quiet reverence of women who had held space for me when I couldn't hold it myself. Her cry was strong and immediate, as if she'd entered with something to say. They placed her on my chest, and I looked into a face that belonged entirely to herself, yet carried every piece of me I thought I'd lost. I whispered her name, and she blinked up at me like she already knew it. I'd never been more sure of anything. The nurse handed me a clipboard of forms, and I filled out each box with steady hands until I reached the line that read, "Father's name." I paused, then left it blank, not out of bitterness, but because some spaces don't need to be filled to be complete. Leora didn't arrive into a void. She arrived into a village, and we were more than enough. Beth took photos, ones I would frame, not just store on a phone. Elena braided my hair while I held the baby, her fingers moving gently through strands like she was tying knots of protection into each twist. No one asked where Jared was. No one mentioned the past. It had no room in this room. We came home 2 days later, the house quieter than ever and somehow more alive. I placed Leora in her crib, stood back and watched her sleep beneath the mobile of stars. That night, as rain tapped against the windows, I sat beside her in the rocker and opened the drawer. I pulled out the paper I'd written weeks ago and read it again. I did not break. Then I added a new line beneath it. And she will never have to learn strength the way I did. The first morning alone with Leora, the house felt like it had been holding its breath. Elena had stepped out for groceries, Beth was back home tending to her toddler, and it was just me and the steady rhythm of my daughter's breathing. She slept in her bassinet beside the couch, wrapped in a yellow blanket that Beth knit during her 3rd trimester. I sat cross-legged on the floor, sipping lukewarm tea, watching the light crawl across the ceiling as if it were tracing the outline of our new life. Everything felt both unfamiliar and completely right. Later that afternoon, a soft knock sounded at the door. I peeked through the window, expecting a neighbor or a delivery. Instead, I saw Jared standing there in a wrinkled dress shirt holding a single white envelope in his hand. I didn't open the door. I simply stood behind it and waited, breath steady, heart unshaken. He didn't knock again. After a long moment, he slid the envelope through the mail slot and walked back down the steps without turning around. I didn't rush to read it. I waited until Leora was napping again, then sat at the kitchen table, opened the flap, and pulled out a handwritten note on blank stationery. The handwriting was unmistakably his, sharp, slanted, a little too forced. "I know you won't write back," it began. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for anything. But I wanted you to know that I watched the video Beth posted of the baby shower. You looked happy, and for what it's worth, I'm glad she'll have that version of you." There was no signature, just a dash and his first initial. I folded the letter once, slid it into a drawer beneath the silverware, and never touched it again. It wasn't closure. I already had that. It was just a footnote in a chapter that no longer dictated my life. That night, I journaled beneath a dim lamp while Leora slept in her crib. "He didn't break me," I wrote again, underlining it slowly. "He just revealed how strong I already was." I thought about how many women had likely sat in similar rooms, writing similar truths into the quiet of new beginnings. And I felt connected to them in a way that made the silence feel warm. 2 weeks later, I stood in the backyard with Leora tucked against my chest in a sling, her tiny body warm and rooted to mine. The hydrangea had doubled in size, its blossoms thick and full like they'd been waiting for someone to witness them. I reached down and plucked one small bloom, tucking it gently into the ribbon of the sling near her shoulder. "You were born into this," I whispered, blooming. Lara stopped by for tea the following Tuesday, not as my attorney, but as a friend. She held Leora with surprising ease, rocking slowly and humming under her breath. "You look like peace," she said to me with a smile. "You look like someone who learned how to let go without losing herself." I didn't respond with words, just nodded, placed my hand over my heart, and breathed. As the weeks passed, the days began to fall into a rhythm. Morning feedings, soft lullabies, slow walks with Leora pressed close against me. The house remained calm, filled with quiet songs, and the scent of lavender from the diffuser Beth insisted on gifting me. I stopped expecting echoes of my old life to return, and they didn't. Jared's absence became so normal it felt like silence never had to be filled. There was peace in that kind of emptiness. My brother visited for the first time since the delivery, carrying a basket of snacks and a single daisy tucked into the side. "Thought you might be low on sleep and compliments," he joked, grinning as he peeked at Leora. She gave him a sleepy blink, which he interpreted as approval. "She's got your eyes," he said after a pause. "But the calm? That's all you." We sat outside on the porch, watching the sun set through the trees like it had nowhere better to be. "I used to worry about you," he admitted. "When you stopped calling, stopped showing up to birthdays, I thought maybe you just didn't care anymore." "I cared," I said softly. "I just didn't know how to explain what was happening without making it worse." He didn't press, just nodded, and we sat in shared silence until Leora stirred. On the day Leora turned 1 month old, I lit a single candle in the living room and placed her in the center of a soft quilt Beth had sewn. It wasn't a party, just a ritual, a quiet marking of time. I read her the letter I'd written the night she was born, the one tucked behind the framed quote on her shelf. She stared up at me like the words mattered, even though she couldn't understand them yet. And I believed they did. A few nights later, I stood barefoot in the kitchen, swaying with Leora asleep against my chest. I hummed without thinking, the same way I did before I knew what waiting for kindness felt like. My eyes landed on the drawer with the old letter from Jared, still untouched. I didn't need to open it again to remember what it said. I just needed to know that even with his apology, the power was still mine. One morning in late spring, I woke up to find Leora smiling in her sleep. Her tiny hand was curled near her face, her lips curved into a soft shape that made my breath catch. I traced her nose with the tip of my finger and whispered, "We're okay." I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop anymore, because there was no more waiting. There was only living. The red sweater Jared had worn the night he handed me the divorce papers still sat in the closet under a pile of donation clothes. I took it out one final time, folded it neatly, and placed it in a bag bound for the shelter downtown. Someone else could use the warmth. Someone else could write a news story with it. Mine didn't need that fabric anymore. Leora cried softly that evening, the kind of cry that wasn't panic, just a request to be held. I picked her up and walked to the nursery window, the same window I once stood beside in fear, now washed in golden light. I whispered to her about strong women, about chosen family, about building homes that don't echo with absence. Her eyes fluttered closed again, and I knew we were already home. Thank you for listening to Steph's story. If you're yet to subscribe, please consider doing so before watching another story on the channel.